Kick off now because I'm conscious that we do only have an hour and there's a lot to talk about. My name is Anna Hamon and I am a policy officer and I work in the Department for Community and Constitutional Affairs, which was formerly Home Affairs. And I'm responsible for getting this disability strategy up and running for a disability strategy for Jersey. Before we get started, I just want to be sure that everybody here is comfortable, they can see what's going on and hear everything they need to. I was informed by the guys setting up earlier that they think the hearing lead is in operation, but the light wasn't showing, so they weren't sure if it was or not. So if anyone does require those facilities, just to let me know. I didn't have any requests in advance, so I don't think anyone does need it, but if they do, let me know. And again, like I say, stop me if I'm going too fast or you can't hear what I'm saying. What I'll do now is just run through the order of what I'm going to talk to you about. So I will nip straight onto that. So my intention is to talk about developing a strategy, how we've got to where we are today, and then take a step back and actually think about, well, why do we need a strategy, and try and answer that question with a definitive, yes, we do. And then the rest of the presentation will focus on what we're asking in this public consultation, so the things, the content of the strategy, and what we want to know from you. I'll then briefly go on to the next steps, so what comes next after this consultation period, and then we can go into questions and answers. It may well be that questions crop up whilst I'm presenting. If that's the case, fine, please do ask away, especially if it's to clarify a point that I've made. It might be that what I say is actually, I'm going to answer that later on, so I might defer your question, but like I said, do ask. I don't want you sitting there confused or not quite sure about what the point is that I'm making. So, with that in mind, I'm going to crack on. So, in terms of developing the strategy and where we've got to, I think the first thing to say is that this is certainly not the beginning of the process for developing a disability strategy for Jersey. We've already come quite a long way and actually spent the last couple of years working closely on research to get to where we are. In terms of the research that we've done already, there's three main parts to it. The first part being a household survey, so the Health and Life Opportunities Survey that took place in 2015. In terms of surveys, it's a little bit like JAS, the Jersey Annual Social Survey, which you may be familiar with. So a quarter of all households on the island were randomly selected to be sent a survey, so that works out as just over 10,000. And the response rate we got was 42%, which gives us confidence that the numbers we got back are statistically significant. So that's to say we can trust the numbers. There was enough people responding to make it representative for the island. And within that survey, we asked questions about the numbers of people with disability and a little bit about their experiences of living in Jersey with a disability. The other part of the research that we've done is the qualitative side of the research. So that's speaking to people and finding out about their lived experience of living in Jersey with a disability. And there were two main parts to that. There was a service user session which took place in this building almost a year ago, and that was with around 50 service users, so disabled people and carers, meeting with politicians and senior policy makers to explain what it feels like for them to live in Jersey. So really the main benefit of that was bringing experiences to life. As much as politicians and policymakers claim to understand, actually when you hear it real life from a person, it can really help change people's perceptions. So that was beneficial in that point of view. The other bit was similar in terms of finding out about people's experiences of life on the island, and that was going out and speaking to around 100 individuals, whether the situation was more comfortable for them. So it might have been in their own home, it might have been part of social groups that they were at, and again just asking questions about life on the island. those two bits of research really have formed the basis of what we're consulting on now. So that is, how do people feel about living in Jersey? What's good, what's not so good, and what needs to change? Then the final bit of research we did was looking at strategies in other countries around the world, just to check that actually what we think is important was the case elsewhere. We didn't want to miss anything out. And we can say that actually, yes, that basically people order things in different ways, they talk about them differently, but fundamentally what we're proposing in this consultation is similar to other places around the world. Another important point in getting to where we are today is that we haven't done it alone. It's not government that's been working on this. We've got my department, so Community and Constitutional Affairs, but also many of the other government departments involved, so lots of different areas of health, such as the hospital, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, other government departments such as Social Security and the Department for Infrastructure, and importantly as well, lots of groups from the voluntary and community sector. So this kind of splurge of words behind me kind of is just a snapshot of the people and organisations that have been involved in this process up to now.
Can I just ask?
Sure.
Did you speak to the Jersey Brain Tumour charity?
No, we did not. We haven't.
That's maybe one that maybe might be interesting.
Okay. Could we speak about that afterwards, and I could get details from you and contact them directly? Are they linked in with the Jersey Disability Partnership, or?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
But yeah, it would definitely worth at this phase doing that. I'll just make a note. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of where we've got to. Then in terms of asking the question, why do we need a strategy? We'll start off talking about the prevalence of disability. The Health and Life Opportunities, the household survey, revealed that 14% of Jersey residents living in private households are disabled as defined by the UK Equality Act. So that's to say they have a physical or mental health condition or illness lasting or expected to last at least 12 months, which impacts on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities, either a little or a lot. So that's one definition of disability that we've used, which, like I say, is 14% of islanders are affected, which translates into almost 14,000 people. So it itself is not an insignificant number.
You're using the word private household.
That's to say, so the survey didn't cover people living in residential homes, for example. So actually, the number would be slightly higher than that. That's what the private part of it means. Or people who happen to be in hospital at the time, for example. But those people were covered in terms of the qualitative side of things. So we did speak to those people, but in terms of capturing the numbers, it's just the private household that number represents. Just broadly comparing that to rates of disability elsewhere, as you can see, it's roughly, it's in the same ballpark as other jurisdictions. Now, one of the issues is exactly how you collect that data, so the way you ask the question and what question you ask can cause some variation. So the numbers in the UK and Guernsey are slightly higher. The number across the EU is also a little bit higher, but in fact the EU number only considers people of working age. Our figure is talking about the whole spectrum of the population. That's one way of looking at numbers when it comes to disability. In addition to that, we ask questions along the UN definition of functional impairments. So it's people who report difficulties with their sight, their hearing, their memory, their mobility. And that number came out as 35% of all islanders having at least one functional impairment to at least a sort of mild degree, which translates to 35,000 individuals, which again is a large number and a large proportion of the population. Which sort of leads us onto the question as what is disability? Which I think the first thing to say about that is that there is no universally agreed definition of disability. There's no one term that defines it. In fact, it's a challenging word in a way because it talks about so many people and it doesn't do justice to the variety of individuals. out there. I've kind of put a little bit in the consultation document about defining disability, and I'll just read a bit from that because what I write is more fluent than what I speak. So I said that disability can be fluctuating and it can be invisible. An individual can feel or consider to be disabled in one situation but not in another. I think the most basic example is if an individual in a wheelchair, if they go into a building that is fully accessible, they'll be able to use the toilet, they'll be able to sit down, they'll be able to get through doorways. They go into a non-accessible building, they won't be able to do any of those basic things. So in one situation, they may be considered disabled, and in the others, they can carry out any activity just as anyone else would. There's also challenges in terms of definition. So an individual may not define themselves as being disabled, but someone else may define them. Or vice versa, someone may feel disabled, but actually they don't fit into a medical definition of disability. So in terms of the strategy, in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, we're talking about disability in the broadest possible sense. So it's about people who have an impairment, a long-term impairment, whether that's physical or mental or intellectual or sensory, and it's about how that impairment interacts with barriers in society. So just going back to that simple example of if a building's set up to meet your needs or not. So
there's always the other thing as well. You can look at a person and they look, as if there's nothing wrong with them.
Exactly.
But you don't know. They could be deaf, or you'd know if they were blind. I've got a friend who's deaf, but looking at her, you wouldn't think.
In terms of invisible disability, there's huge challenges. But also, if you do have a more visible disability, that can equally lead to problems of people making assumptions about you and assuming things that aren't necessarily correct.
True.
So both ways it can be really difficult. But I think the thing to point out is that disability affects us all. Looking at it with the lens of the ageing population, for example, the survey showed that 51% of people aged over 85 were disabled according to the UK Equality Act, and 92% of people over 85 had at least one functional impairment, so memory or sight or hearing difficulties. So just the fact of getting older, the likelihood is that people may well acquire a disability. Regardless, to mention people who have family members and friends who they know, I would challenge anyone on the island to say, I don't know anyone who has a disability. I think you'd live a sheltered life if that was the case. So I think it's about rewriting it. It's not them and us, it's just us. This is something that affects everyone. We need to sort of change that thinking, I think, on the island slightly. And that's why, with this strategy, we're saying it needs to be owned by the whole island. It's not a case of government imposing things onto other people. It's about people taking ownership and saying, yes, this is something we need and something we want to do something about. So we've spoken about how disability can affect us all. In terms of the case for a strategy, why do we need a strategy? The Health and Life Opportunities Survey, so the postal survey, asked about people's well-being. We based that on the Office for National Statistics measure of well-being. One, because it meant they did all the hard work in working out what was the best way to ask those questions, but also it meant then we could compare ourselves with the UK and their data as well. So the way the ONS does it is that they ask 4 questions which build up to a picture of well-being. So they ask how satisfied you are with your life, how happy you're feeling on the particular day that you're asked the question, how anxious you're feeling on the particular day that you're asked the question, and whether or not you feel that the things you do in life are worthwhile. And essentially, there was a difference between disabled and non-disabled islanders and their responses. So, for example, when it comes to life satisfaction, disabled islanders reported to be 6.8 out of 10 satisfied with life, but that's compared to 8.4 for non-disabled islanders. And there's a similar theme running throughout, so in terms of happiness it was 6.9 to 8.3. And in terms of anxiety, which obviously you want a lower number, so disabled people reported a figure of 5 out of 10 compared to non-disabled islanders as 4 out of 10. And again, similar trend in terms of whether or not you feel your life is worthwhile, so 7 to 8.3. It's worth pointing out that the figures for disabled islanders are very similar to numbers in the UK, so that's very close. But where the difference is actually for non-disabled islanders have a much higher sense of well-being, or a higher sense of well-being in the island compared to the UK. So if Jersey's such a great place to live for other people, then why isn't that the case for everyone? Why is there this kind of well-being gap? Where's the difference? I mean, ultimately, that's what we're looking at with the strategy, is how do we close that gap and level things up and make it an even playing field. In a minute, I'm going to go on to talk about the detail within the consultation. But before I do that, I just wanted to make a point about the difference between strategy and legislation. I don't know if anyone was at, there was a conference, it was either last week or the week before, that Enable set up, and it was attended by Professor Anna Lawson, who is a specialist in disability rights in the legal sense in the UK for Leeds University. And the point that she made was that you can't have one or the other, you need both. The full picture in terms of improving equality in the island is actually to have policy and strategy working alongside legislation. So like I said, the bit that I'm dealing with is the strategy. The bit that will be coming up, work is beginning this year, which is the responsibility of the Department of Social Security, is legislation. So legislation, the way I see it, is the backstop. It's about bringing people to account if they don't do what they should be doing and if they treat people unfairly. But before you get to that stage, what you want to create is a culture and an island and an atmosphere that doesn't cause people to discriminate in the first place. So where the strategy focuses on is about changing people's attitudes, about changing services and policies, and about changing infrastructure. So the strategy is really the proactive bit, and the legislation is the reactive bit. And neither can work without the other. You need that to complement each other. Before I go on to the consultation detail bit, has anyone got any questions on anything that I've been talking about so far?